Because the one thing that non-neurotypical seem to share, and I'm including in this children on the autism spectrum, when someone's triggering us and our sympathetic nervous system and making us have an amygdala hijack.
Oh,
and
wow.
I just stood there with tears streaming down my face thinking, I knew this boy had a brain.
Sandy Hall has a master's in education and a major in counseling psychology. She's a resilience coach and facilitator and the founder of Recognition, a leadership development consultancy. With mental distress now impacting 1 in 3 and anxiety on the rise, Sandy has spent her life looking into practical ways we can bolster positive mental health. Sandy, welcome to the show. So great to have you here today.
Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm super excited to be here, and it's lovely to share with you, my colleague. You're so easy to talk to, Brad.
Well, likewise. It's a privilege to have you here, and I know that what we're going to talk about today will have lots of value for many of the people out there listening and watching. Perhaps before we dive in, you could share a little bit about your story, who you are, what you do.
So it's actually hard to talk about my story, Brad, and the reason it's hard is that I have spent my life pretending that I'm not non-neurotypical, because I grew up in an era where we didn't talk about cognitive difference. It wasn't considered acceptable. And it heartens me now to see so many people sharing their stories online on LinkedIn, people bravely sharing that they've got a cognitive difference, and being able to talk freely about their neurodiversity. And I think we're in an era now where people are doing this more and more. But I still have to dig through the barriers that I've put up from a lifetime of masking and pretending that my brain works the same as other people's brains.
What is neurodivergence?
That's a very fascinating question. Neurodivergence, technically, is where your brain sits across the spectrum that's different to what we would call neurotypical. So it's non-neurotypical, really. And it can be anything from ADHD, dyspraxia, dyslexia. There's a lot of different categorizations now. I won't go through them all the way through to full-blown autism.
Okay. And I guess that most of us, when we say neurotypical, where does anxiety and all of those types of disorders, this is different to neurodivergence?
It is, but it comes with it. So when you've been brought up in a society that tells you that your brain must sit within the norm in order to be neurotypical, that brings anxiety with it.
This episode is brought to you by Start With Values. If you'd like to reduce stress and increase fulfillment in your work and life, then check out startwithvalues.com. There, you'll be able to download the Values app, which helps you to discover your core values and bring them to life through micro habits. There is a values course so that you can learn about the science and practice of core values, and you'll be able to pre-register for my forthcoming book called Start With Values. I hope that these tools will enable you to achieve more fulfillment and make more meaningful decisions on your journey of life. Now back to the episode.
And I think it's a little bit of a chicken and egg scenario. We don't know yet what it would be like to be brought up in a society where non-neurotypical would be considered completely neurotypical. So you don't know whether you would not have anxiety. I remember as a little girl looking up at my mum when I was about 3 years old. It's one of my earlier memories, thinking there's something different about my mum. And it wasn't until she was in her 60s that she realised that she was what they call Asperger's, which is a mild form of autism. She was high functioning. She was a very bright, funny, very punny woman, but she didn't have normal relationships. And because her friendships were black and white, and she saw the world through black and white lens, she was a very different kind of mother. She lacked empathy, being a classic example of a thing that you can talk about between a a parent and a child. And so I grew up in an environment where my father had empathy, but my mother didn't have a lot of empathy. But I knew my mother loved me dearly. But I can remember things like her being very annoyed that I wanted to go and play with friends after school, because that was going to upset her having an afternoon nap, and that was going to take her out of her comfort zone. And I remember thinking, but I need friends, that's normal. And she wouldn't allow me to do that. And I couldn't understand what was going on. That led and fed into what I wasn't realizing at the time was the early onset of my ADD. Now, did it come about because of my childhood? Did it come about because it was a genetic, inherited piece? We don't really know the answers to that. But what I do know is that alongside my mild ADD, which I didn't uncover until my son was born and we had difficulty with him learning at school, I developed very severe anxiety related to the fact that my brain didn't pick up on things the way the brains around me that were learning in the classroom next to me were picking up on things. I could understand a concept as it was being explained, but then I couldn't remember it again the next day, unless I was interested in it. And if it was in an area I was interested in, like something creative and artistic, I'd flourish in that area. But things like maths and science just became an enormous challenge. And I got really good at masking. And so I got through school and I survived. And then I went into the workforce and discovered quite quickly that I gravitated towards work that had an element of risk. Because the minute I experienced risk, and technology back then was starting to grow, so mainframe technology, and I was working in the operations side of mainframe technology, and if one of these big machines went down, you had to very, very quickly get it back up again. I loved that. And so through absolute dumb luck, I fell into the right kind of work, and I figured out how to turn my brain on, and I was brilliant in those situations. I would have probably been great in ICU as well, or an emergency department, if I'd been able to get through medical school, which of course I couldn't, because I couldn't get my brain to study statistics or maths or science. It just wouldn't focus. But when it came to the human sciences, it suddenly lit up.
So interesting that you also found technology. And I have a very similar story and struggled to focus, especially on those technical things, but found computers quite engaging and, in fact, a whole lot of fun. What do you think that's about?
Emergent knowledge, it's new. And that's what I love about technology. And yet my competency around technology over the years has shifted. I love AI, for example, and I'm an early adopter on those kind of platforms, but get me to try and do anything operational and repetitive in the background, and I just can't do it.
That makes so much sense. I think you're on the money with emergent technology. It's something that's new and exciting. What drove me to it was that the internet was new, and I thought, I want to make these things. I want to make these websites. I want to make web apps. And so suddenly I had this passion, and it was easy to focus as long as I was interested. So how can people, and I'm sure there are many people out there who have some form of attention deficit disorder, how can people, navigate the modern world, especially with all of the distractions and everything competing for our attention? It must be even harder for young people.
I think it is harder. And look, I learned so much about this when my son, I remember him being 8 years old and trying to figure out what was going on for him at school. So at the age of 3, he could read the headlines of the newspaper. Yes, we had newspapers back then and they're disappearing now. But he could read the headlines and he had an inquiry mind, and he would ask me all sorts of fascinating questions like, why are we here? He had a really developed sense of humor and he made great connections and friendships. And then he went to school and he started to unlearn. So number one, he was very introverted. So in a classroom with 35 children, he was overwhelmed and he just disappeared into the background. Number two, he wasn't able to grasp the concepts, which started to remind me of my childhood. And number three, he had severe brain fog. So I remember going to a range of specialists trying to get a diagnosis. And it took a while until we finally got ADD, and he was -4 on the TOVA test. I was -2 because I realized I needed to test myself when I saw this. I thought, he's got some of the things I've got, so maybe he's inherited it from me. Initially, they thought he might be Asperger's, and we'd been through the process of my mother's diagnosis, so we understood it a bit more. And Jordan didn't like change, and he wanted mastery. And so he was 8 years old. I had no choice really after one of the teachers said to me, get him out of here, to take him out of school and figure out a learning environment for him. And so I put him into a homeschool group that was based on Montessori. So there he had the opportunity to learn mastery and to go back to the early building blocks of learning and learn reading, writing and math and using things he was interested in. And back then it was Pokemon. And so he would learn to count using Pokemon, and he would learn to write stories based on Pokemon, not Janet and John books that he thought was dumb. And then to my absolute surprise, 3 months into this homeschool environment, I remember standing at the back of the group picking him up after the session that day. And there he was, very, very haltingly reading an adult version of Lord of the Rings to the class.
No.
And
Wow.
I just stood there with tears streaming down my face thinking, I knew this boy had a brain. I knew it. I knew he was bright. He just had a very different learning style. And that began my journey of understanding non-neurotypical, because I realized several things. They didn't know how to diagnose him. Was he Asperger's? Was he ADD, non-hyperactive? Because he wasn't a hyper kid. He was very daydreamy and very inclined to just lose all focus. We actually ended up running that homeschool group in my own home, and I stayed on board that journey for 5 years. I loved being in that environment, and I read everything that I could read on the subject. I discovered that the medical professionals and the thought leaders had two different views. So your medical professionals said it's a disorder, it's a disability, you must medicate. In fact, in Australia, you have to medicate a child for them to be in the education system if they have a diagnosis of ADHD or ADD.
You have to medicate.
You have to medicate for them to attend public school. I then discovered some of the other thought leaders like Garrett Laporto, who wrote a book that explained what's going on in a non-neurotypical brain and how they focus and concentrate so differently. And I started to correlate that to what was happening for Geordie. So, for example, they said it's really important that these kids get exercise. So they need a physical outlet. Now, for my daydreamy kid who would go off into la la land, you'd think physical exercise wasn't important, whereas the ADHD kid who's hyper, you can see that they're going to need exercise. But for Geordie, it was just as important. And actually, he needed something that included an element of balance, and that balance was going to be very good for his brain. So he loved to skateboard. That was a really good thing for him to use balance. And he loved to drum, which is left hand, right hand. It works on the synapses of getting the brain firing across all the areas. And Garrett Laporto talked about that. Exercise, left brain, right brain, getting them actually doing something physical before they start to learn, giving them a situation where they can have mastery. And I realized that actually I'd fallen into a good environment with the Montessori method for him. It was perfect for his brain because he needed mastery so that he could actually build something, and then allowing them to focus in an area that they're passionate about. So because he loved Pokemon, that was a perfect alignment of his passion to a learning program. Now, not easy to do because you've got to pull them out of the public system. It costed a lot of money to do that, and I ended up having to run the homeschool group in my own home. But I had this beautiful 13 children attending this homeschool group who all were non-neurotypical in one way or another. And they had fallen out of the public system because they were either suicidal at an early age. Can you believe that an 8-year-old child could be suicidal?
No.
Luckily, I wasn't dealing with that myself, but some of these children were. And that's because they were just experiencing life being so difficult in the environments that they were in. Not their families, in the education environment. It was an anathema to them. Now, what I noticed about these children is that they had some collective similarities. One, they cared about the planet. way more than their peers. They were deep thinkers. I remember my son, the minute he could talk, asking about why we're here and thinking he's got some really interesting concepts that are different to his peers already about why we're here and the way we're treating the planet. That was something I saw they definitely shared in common. They challenged traditional thinking models. Things like politics, for example, they were going to think outside the square on. Different ideologies. The other factor that it took me a long time to uncover was around this sense of spirituality. So if you think of intelligence as being IQ, intellectual quotient, EQ, emotional quotient, SQ, social quotient, or spiritual quotient, I've heard talk about that in some fields, then their IQ can be very good in the area they're interested in. So in my son's case, it was maths, very like my mum, really good mathematically, could grasp concepts quickly, including quantum physics. And he was drawn to it right from an early age. But he couldn't handle reading and writing. And he wasn't interested in forming a logical, structured argument. And so that let him down. And he was also so introverted that he would be an under-responder in most situations. So he wouldn't even contribute to the conversation. And occasionally when he did, everyone would look sideways like, wow, where did that come from? Because it was deep, but also anxious, because he knew he didn't fit. And so we had 13 of these children, and they all were profoundly spiritually aware. Now, I'm not talking about religion here. I'm talking about the sense of otherness. And what I came to really cherish about this environment was that they had this little circle they would do every morning where they would get together and they would share about how they felt, what they were concerned about. They could cry together, they could laugh together, they could be angry together, they could rage together. And the teachers allowed that to happen. And they learnt some basic soft skills about relationships. And it was a safe environment. Because the one thing that non-neurotypical teens seem to share, and I'm including in this children on the autism spectrum, is they pick up on social dynamics in a different way. And they have this quality I would call guilelessness, which is they might lack an empathy, but they could never be deliberately cruel to something. The opposite of what you see in a narcissist or a sociopath. So then, a lie, which is something that sits outside their black and white, is an anathema. Why would you do that? Why would you tell an untruth? That upsets the whole social norm. So for them, classroom dynamics make them extremely anxious, and in some cases actually suicidal. Do you translate that and you fast forward that into the workplace?
Yeah.
Who thrives in the workplace today? Those who can influence and control. An authentic leader who genuinely cares about others can be a very powerful leader indeed. But equally and oppositely, a narcissistic leader or a sociopathic leader can control and manipulate others.
It's fascinating. Can neurodiverse people succeed in the modern workplace?
Yes, they totally can, and they often do. And there's lots of workplaces where they're drawn to. So they're drawn to technology. There's a disproportionate number of non-neurotypical drawn to technology because normally they're mathematically sharp and smart and they can hyper-focus. And they're drawn to engineering, precision fields, where mastery is key. Even some of the medical professionals they're drawn to as well. But they're probably not drawn to sales and service in the same extent.
And many founders are probably on that spectrum.
Because their appetite for risk. So they're drawn to risk. That was the thing that Garrett Laporto talked about. And there's many thought leaders in this field now. But if you think about the attributes that people who are non-neurotypical share in common, they're guileless, they like the truth, they like facts, they are they hyper-focus. Many of them have a self-soother. So a thing that they might do when they feel that they're super, super, super uncomfortable, but they also are hyper-aware of social dynamics. Now, that manifests in different ways. So it manifests in ways where either they feel like they're fighting the system, or they feel like they're trying to shift the system. And parenting a child who is non-neurotypical is immensely challenging because of this fact that they will have these meltdowns. And then they will also try to deconstruct control mechanisms, which is absolutely fascinating. I remember when I was doing my master's in career development, and I had a particular group of young people that were referred to my private practice, and they were actually the children of Centrepoint. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Centrepoint. Centrepoint's a cult that was based in Albany.
I heard of it.
By the deceased Bert Potter, who was an absolute narcissist and sociopath. And that story we won't go into today, but these young people who had grown up in Centrepoint had parents who were psychologists, engineers, very, very bright parents. And they grew up being exposed to sexual abuse and a power figure who gave them issues with authority. And so they struggled to stay employed. So they sought me out for career support. And they were a delight to work with because they were incredibly intelligent young people who were, most of them, very bright and very talented. And I would say a large percentage of them were non-neurotypical, although that's not anything we explored at the time. It's only looking back at it retrospectively I recognize it now. Because they were very spiritual, but they didn't like therapeutic language. And I was a practitioner in a methodology called clean language, where you don't use therapeutic language. And to them, therapeutic language was an anathema because they grew up at Centrepoint, which was a therapeutic community, and it reminded them of their abuse. So I was able to work quite safely with them and help them understand and deconstruct authority figures in the workplace and to navigate towards workplaces where that was not going to be a challenge. A less dictatorial workplace, a workplace where they could be respected, where the model was that of servant leadership, and where their unique skills and talents could be of value. And actually, they also had to learn not to tell people where they came from, because at Friday night drinks it became the main subject matter, and that was really excruciatingly embarrassing for them. So they just didn't talk about their childhood at work. But it's interesting when you look back at what society viewed as being non-neurotypical, even just 15 years ago, to what we see as non-neurotypical now, and actually the emergence of a large proportion of young people coming through now as being non-neurotypical. Mm-hmm. I worked for the kindergarten company over lockdown, and they discovered that a large majority of young people, and I won't say their name because this is not a statistic I can quote in a podcast because they didn't have any data behind it, but anecdotally, they were experiencing a lot more young people coming through as non-neurotypical at an early age. So they're experiencing the tippy toes or the meltdowns or the soothing behavior emerging more frequently in their young children than they'd ever seen before. Now, I'm not saying it's related to COVID because it's not, but what we're seeing is it's increasing across society. As we are adult assessments of ADHD, we're getting more and more people going, oh gosh, that's actually me, and I didn't realise it before because it's becoming more known. Or are we experiencing an increase? We don't know. And is it related to the fact we're forever interrupted by this?
It could be. It could be. That deconstructing leadership is fascinating. I'd never thought about that, but I've met people over the course of my life, including myself, who don't deal well with having a traditional boss and a traditional work environment. And often they are not neurotypical. They really struggle with that kind of authority and rigidity and the KPIs and the OKRs and all of that kind of stuff. So that's fascinating, which makes me wonder about all of these freelancers that you meet who have realized that the only way for themselves to thrive is to have their own business, to be in, have mastered something. And I think you have lots of examples of that. But then also the increase must be connected potentially in some way. I mean, if I had had a mobile phone as a kid, I don't think I would have just ended up gaming or I don't know. It can't help if you're on that spectrum.
Yeah. I mean, I was very lucky because my son was one of the manifestations of his non-neurotypical is that he didn't want to be a typical kid, so he didn't want a phone. And then when he did get a phone, he wanted a low-functioning Android phone that wouldn't do anything because he didn't want to engage with social media platforms.
Interesting. Okay. That's good. Good for him. Good for him. Yeah. I mean, everyone's different. For some of us,
part of his life. Very easy to parent.
yeah, absolutely. So obviously it's on the rise. I wonder if we ever get to the point where it's just fully embraced. Like, this is a strength that you have. Your ability to hyper focus is incredible, but make sure that you balance that with recovery and care, where it's embraced rather than trying to force people to adapt their behavior to what is typical.
Well, this is where I think Stephen Kotler and Jamie Wheel's work around the new science of flow is really powerful. And it's no mistake to me that they set up the Flow Genome Project working with Google and Microsoft in Silicon Valley, where there's a very large proportion of non-neurotypical young people who are drawn to the tech sector. And their children, therefore, are also going to have that same DNA switch. And when you look at the neuroscience of flow, which has been around the concept's been around for hundreds of years. The Chinese were talking about it. Lea Su was talking about it. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's been talking about it before, Kotler and Wheeler. The reality is that a neurotypical brain also will focus better when they're doing something they're interested in and where they actually allow their brain to be set up in a way that is optimized as much as a non-neurotypical brain. So our society, and I actually think the world of work is a little bit broken because a lot of workplaces aren't set up to allow people to get into flow.
Yeah.
Actually, open plan offices are a classic example of that. Loud music, people being interrupt driven, people not being able to set up their own workspaces the way they need to set them up, or having to hot desk all the time. So actually it's counterintuitive. And, we found out when lockdowns occurred that lots of people could focus better at home. That's if they had the right home environment. Of course, if they were set up on the kitchen table with their children or in a flat with 20 other people all trying to work from home, it wasn't quite so optimum, but did discover a little bit more about allowing someone to set up a setting so that they can hyper-focus. So then we lost collaboration systems and that broke down. So we're still struggling to find the balance because really we're not designed to go and work in great big buildings with artificial light and no actual blue light coming in through the windows, and sit in meeting rooms where we jump from meeting to meeting to meeting, or Zoom call to Zoom call to Zoom call, and expect our brain to continue to focus.
I think when we look back, it's going to be a very strange period in time, almost as we look back at the start of the industrial era, and there were kids working in factories, and we look back horrified, like, wow, people spent all day, there were children operating machines. In 100 years, maybe not even that far away, people look back and go, what? Everyone traveled, they got stuck in traffic to get to these buildings where you would spend all day seated in front of a desk with high levels of cortisol and adrenaline. And then you go back through this traffic and the commute to get back home for a few hours before you fall asleep and do it again. I mean, no wonder there's a mental health epidemic. It's so unnatural. It's only been around for about 50 years, this kind of concept.
I know. And it reminds me of the piece I've been doing a lot lately around adaptability quotient, which is a key intelligence or competency that you need to develop to be able to survive in today's workforce. And leaders need to certainly have it to lead, where actually we need to do the opposite to what our brains want to do, which is to actually create norm and get everything to stay the same all the time so that we feel safe. But we actually have to move to being more agile. Our environment is not set up to optimize our success, because actually it's set up to continually shift and change. That means that we're forever combating this part of us that wants the status quo to stay normal and safe. But there's also another big key piece here, I think, around our spiritual quotient, which is key. And workplaces can't engage with this. Certainly in the Western world, we don't see it, where our spiritual selves, our sense of soulfulness, our sense of purpose actually gets left behind. So that very question my son started to ask when he was 3 years old, like, why are we here, Mummy? Which made me think, this is a different brain. His brain is inquiring on a subject matter that's not normal for a 3-year-old to be inquiring on. And he was different to his peers in that way, which was my first little clue that something different was going on and that he was non-neurotypical. It's a classic piece that needs to be solved when you're dealing with people who are non-neurotypical, because they actually care about the environment, and they actually care about truth and honesty and justice and fairness far more than a neurotypical. Of course, a neurotypical does as well, but to a non-neurotypical, it's of heightened importance. And that's why they see it as black and white. They want it to be fair, and they want everyone to be treated fairly. And so a leader has to be fair and has to build trust in the environment. Otherwise, they won't create a safe place for people to work. So psychosocial safety is becoming more important than it ever was before. And it's a minefield for leaders.
It must be. It must be. Perhaps you could share a little bit of the work you do in terms of helping leaders and transforming workplaces. And what are some tips for effective leadership in this very rapidly changing world?
I think it starts with the organisation, and I work with small to medium commercial organisations. So they're small enough and they're normally growing quickly, and they want to scale, and they want to make sure that their leaders scale with the organisation. And so we go in and we map out a framework of how they want their leaders to lead, and in 3 key areas: how they want them to lead the team, the business, whatever the function is that they're leading, how they want them to lead the people, and then how they want them to lead themselves. And those 3 key areas translate into a set of competencies that we then map out and we assess, and we put a leadership development plan in place, and then we might run a program of work. And a couple of the typical things we might do might be around practical calm and around courageous conversations. So teaching those leaders how to stay calm within themselves when they are dealing with a world that's changing all the time, and a workplace that's changing all the time. So how do they stay calm? Because their people are watching them and are looking to them all the time. So they have to look after themselves, number one. So that's basic anti-fragile resilience skills. And then how do they have those courageous conversations with their team members? How do they balance performance with care and help people step up and feel like they are growing their careers and actually work effectively and get the support they need to work in an environment that's actually growing and changing? So commercial environments are normally fast growth if they're doing well, and even in a tough economy, that's still happening. And I think that one of the biggest things for leaders is that no leader should have to lead alone. They should have a coach. They should have a mentor. They should have a safe space where they can go and go, I'm dealing with this challenge right now. How do I work this through with this individual? How do I deal with this person? I keep finding myself dealing with this kind of difficult character. This is a pattern in my leadership. Why am I drawing these people into my team? And then how do I handle them when I get them? Because generally speaking, when someone's triggering us and our sympathetic nervous system and making us have an amygdala hijack, it's because of something we haven't resolved in ourselves.
That's an
I
interesting
know I
point.
waffled. I didn't answer that in a straightforward way, but
No, I like it. I like it.
that's my ADD brain.
So many questions. One, can you outline a courageous conversation? Because for viewers who are potentially neurodivergent, I think it's a super skill because we can tend to avoid these types of conversations. But also for everyone, who needs to have a difficult conversation, humans are naturally averse to conflict. So what is a courageous conversation, and how do you have one?
A really nice way to look at it is using Kim Scott's amazing work, and actually she came out of Silicon Valley as well. No surprise. So she was probably working with a large percentage of neurodivergent people in workplaces in the tech sector, and she calls it radical candor. And on her classic 2x2, we either don't say anything at all, or we don't want to hurt someone's feelings, so we use ruinous empathy, or we don't say anything and then we explode because it's all got too much, and then we actually have a meltdown with that person, which is not good either, or we have a radical candid conversation. So your question is, how do we have a radically candid conversation? Number one, we need to be able to connect with that person where they're at, and we can only do that using empathy. And once we use empathy, real empathy, not ruinous empathy, where we worry about hurting their feelings so we don't say anything. Real empathy, you might get alongside someone, for example, who is perhaps not always telling the truth to their workmates, and their workmates then don't trust them so much because they're not always telling the truth, and say, hey, I notice that in this situation, sometimes you tell a white lie, or sometimes you don't tell the truth. You've got to be specific, and you've got to give them an actual example so they can understand it. And then you give them a chance to stop and think and pause and respond to you and tell you why they might be doing that. And so you've got to be able to sit with someone with empathy and non-judgment and actually allow them to open up and say, actually, I didn't tell the truth because I didn't feel safe in that situation, and I felt put on the spot, and I hadn't actually done what I knew I should have done because I didn't know how to do it. And then as a leader, you can say, I'm so glad you told me that, because now I can help you understand how to do it. And in fact, let's do it together. And we'll do this step by step so that next time this happens, you don't have to tell a white lie and say you've done it when you haven't done it.
Yeah.
And that's radical candor, when the person that you're helping perform feels cared for. That's balancing performance with care. And it requires being calm yourself and actually being able to have that brave conversation, which is risky because people sometimes get defensive and they react badly when you call them out on something that they've done that deep down they know was wrong. And you've got to be able to sit with them and non-judgment, which takes time and energy, and being calm.
That's where tactical calm comes in.
You build this amazing culture and people trust you, and then you can truly lead. Because leading is not standing up front telling people what to do. It's sitting back, supporting them and doing it. It's balancing performance with you.
I love that. And what are your thoughts about becoming friends with your team members?
It's interesting. I have clients who do that really well and clients who don't. Technically, we're not meant to. As a leader, become friends with our team members because the balance of power is not equal. It's a little bit like a therapist becoming friends with their clients. The balance of power is not equal. So I think it has to be done with a great deal of thoughtfulness, recognizing that there's an imbalance of power and blurred lines. It's not that you can't be. In fact, some of the best teams I have ever worked in have become lifelong friends. But normally it's the peers I've become lifelong friends with.
Interesting.
But I bet you can remember the best leaders you've worked for, because I can remember mine.
they were all exceptionally kind.
Yeah. I'll never forget, and I'm going to say his name, Kieran Cooney was the first CEO I worked with who knew how to do radical candor. And in my first week, when we got to an off-site, I'd had to run a session with my leaders that I was working alongside of my peer leaders around recruitment because we had a high turnover. And I ran the session, and at the end of the session, he over lunch said to me, "Hey, have you got 5 minutes? Let's talk about your session." And so I was delighted that he was interested in talking to me, and went and sat down with him, and he said, "How do you think it went?" And I talked to him about how I thought it went. He said, "What do you think didn't go so well?" And I talked to him about some of the things that I was learning about the team. And I said, "Oh, look, I'm out of my depth, actually. I haven't done this before, and this is a new job, and I want to impress everyone. I hope I did." And he said, "Do you want me to tell you?" And I had that horrible little butterfly feeling inside me at the time, like, yes. And then I had to fight my defensiveness when he said, "Well, you did good. You got the outcome you needed. You might have thrown some of your peers under the bus for some of the things you said." And I went, that feeling of I can barely breathe. I just want to hide. In fact, I'm dying inside right now. And then he said, "But it's okay." And he reached over and he touched my wrist in a really non-creepy way. And he said, "Do you want me to help you fix it?" And I said, "Yes, please." And I was like a scared little 3-year-old. And he said, "Look, go talk to so-and-so and so-and-so and apologise. Just be upfront and just go, 'Hey, have you got a moment?' And I think I might have thrown you under the bus, and I'm really sorry. Rookie error. Can you forgive me? I really want to be someone you trust." Just go say that to them. I guarantee you they'll respond well. And so I did. I raced off and I did exactly that. And he was waiting for me to come back and tell him how it had gone. And I raced back after because both those conversations went really well. And I said, "I did it. I did the thing and it went really well." I felt like a 3-year-old. I really did. And he said, and he just patted me on the back and said, "Well done. We're going to be a great team." And, I knew every time he said, "Have you got a moment?" I would be doing some learning. But he was doing it with everyone, and he was helping us perform. And he created such a culture of trust where we all felt safe and could be our best selves. And we knew if we mucked up, we could be vulnerable and real. And I'll never forget one day at a conference, talking to him before the conference, he said, "Sandy, I think I'm going to tell my story on stage, and it's going to be really emotional, and I'm nervous about that." He's a great speaker. I said, "You got to do it. You've created this vulnerable culture of real. Do it. Go up and do it. Just be real. Just talk from your heart." And because he battled cancer when he was young. And I'll never forget that day. He got up and he spoke. And you could hear a pin drop. People were just absolutely riveted. And he had so much to share because he battled cancer and he learned a lot about himself on that journey. And because he built this culture of trust and respect, people just trusted and respected him more because he told a good story. And afterwards he came and he grabbed me and he said, "It went down well, didn't it?" I went, "Oh my goodness, you've got no idea."
Wow.
You have just upped the trust levels. The oxytocin's even higher now than what it was before. And that's authentic leadership.
That's authentic leadership. What drives you, and why are you so interested in these types of topics and empowering others and helping others on their journey?
I think, it's funny, I reflected on this a lot because I'm 64 this month, so, why am I still doing it and why do I still enjoy it? And I do. I want to keep doing it as long as I can. I think having an Asperger's mum who I realised I became her therapist from a really early age, so I became the person that she would pour her heart out to and talk about her anxieties with. Absolutely opened a pathway of being fascinated by the human condition in my mind. And I think I share some of her traits. I'm not technically Asperger's, but I think I have some of those traits of wanting the world to be a better place. And that's what drives me. I'm driven by understanding human connection, wholeheartedness in the sense that Brené Brown describes it as, and how to help other people be their true, authentic self. Because that's the heart of non-neurotypical. If someone who's cognitively diverse can recognize their own unique talents and what they bring to the table and find their place in the world and have a sense of belonging, then they can thrive and they can contribute to society. As opposed to what we see in our prisons in America and the UK, where 96% of people in the prisons in both the UK and America test positively for ADHD. Now, I see these as people who grew up in the world of abnormal rearing, who also probably didn't thrive at school. They struggled to concentrate and pay attention, and they gravitated towards risk, or their ability to control themselves didn't develop because they weren't supported in their home or at school. And so they became antisocial. And if we could shift that needle just a little bit, we'd be better off for it as a society.
I love that. For people who are interested in potentially connecting with you, following your work, where would you like them to go?
Great question. If they're LinkedIn, follow me on LinkedIn. If they're Insta, you can follow Recognition on Insta now. I just started doing it, and on Facebook, Cognitive Diversity is my Facebook. But they're all linked now, and I do want to go on and do a PhD around this area next year, so I will be looking for research fields to work with. So please connect with me if you're interested in this field, particularly if you are a professional in the workplace and you don't mind sharing your story. I know it's challenging and hard to do because there's an awful lot of delimiters out there in the workplace around cognitive diversity, and people are getting bolder and sharing their story, which is very heartening. It's certainly not been the case for the majority of my career, but I'm very delighted that people are now sharing it more openly, and I do want to work with leaders who are comfortable talking about it when I do my PhD.
Sign me up. Sandy, thank you so much. You are an amazing speaker, and I encourage everyone to take that step, connect with you. I'm sure we'll do this again. Thanks for all of the being a force for good in this world. I personally, you have always inspired me, so I appreciate and thank you for your time. Any final thoughts for our listeners who have stayed with us this long?
Final thought, if you're a parent with a child who's non-neurotypical, I have got a wealth of resources, so please connect. I have got so many books you can read, and I can probably give you some shortcuts. Find Gareth Laporto. His work is amazing in this field as well. It's really helpful for parenting a child who's non-neurotypical, and that's not necessarily an easy journey. Also, Mind Over Matter has got a really great charity that works with parents, with young people who are non-neurotypical as well. Well, with connecting.
Mind Over Matter. We'll put that in the show notes, as well as links to all of your social media channels. I really want to give your furry friend a hug on the sofa behind you over there. He looks so cute. It's been a while since I've given him a good pat.
He takes Mount Eden every morning and every night, and that's really, really, really great for someone who's dealing with ADD, because it helps me focus and practice my gratitude and my breath work.
Well, it looks like he's pretty tired out right now. Very relaxed. Thank you, Sandy. We'll see you again soon, and thank you to everyone who tuned into the podcast today.